We're in a series on the miracles, and if you haven't noticed, we have been focused in on the life of Christ for several months now. And the longer we got into it, and the more we prayed about it, the more we thought about it, the more we decided that it would be a really good thing, since He is the author and perfecter of our faith, to spend even more time in the life of Christ. So we're going to be in the miracles, and then we're going to go to some of the major encounters that Jesus had with the people around Him. And we're going to go right on into summer, focused in on Jesus. Does that sound like a good idea? I think it's a great idea, and I'd like to say it was mine, but it wasn't. It was Nate's. So if you want to read through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, several times in preparation for these series, that'd be a great thing to do, I'm sure. Today, we're going to look at a miracle as one of my favorites, and if you've been here a long time, you've heard me preach on this text. In fact, 43 years ago when I came and interviewed, I preached on this text. Now, no, I did not pull an old sermon. We reworked it, although it was tempting. We reworked it and looked at it because this particular event in Jesus' life was a life-changing event. For those who participated. It goes something like this, and then we're going to read through it and work our way through it and unpack it. Jesus was by the Sea of Galilee. He was teaching, and people had heard that He was there, and there was a big crowd that followed Him. And they were pressing in, trying to hear what He had to say, to the point where He was apparently backed up to the water's edge and had no place to go. And He looked around and He saw Peter's boat over there. Peter, James, and John were over there. They were fishermen, and they fished all night, which was the common thing to do in the Sea of Galilee. And they were washing and taking care of their nets for the day. And He approached Simon Peter and He said, "Can I get in your boat, and would you push out a little bit and drop your anchor, and I'll teach from there?" And Simon was fine with that. And the Bible indicates that Simon had already met Jesus at this point, and so he was familiar with Him. It wasn't a totally out of the air, out of the blue thing. And Jesus taught the crowds from the boat. When He dispersed the crowds, then He turned to the guys and He said, "Let's launch out into the deep." That's the King James. "Let's push out into deep water and let down your nets for a catch of fish." And Simon said, "We've been out all night. We haven't caught a thing. But," and this is the key phrase in this whole thing, "regardless of that, because you say so, we will do it." And so they went out into the deep water and they let down their nets, and they caught a big mess of fish. So big they had to call for the other boat to come in and help them. And they were amazed at what they saw, and they worshiped. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me. From now on I will make you fishers of men." And they left everything they had and followed Him. Pretty cool story. And you'll probably remember, if you grew up in church, "I will make you fishers of men," you sang when you were little. That comes from this text. So I said before, I like this because this was a life-changing event. Not only in the lives of the disciples, but it was a world-changing event. From that time forward, as the disciples left everything that they had to follow Jesus wholeheartedly, all in, the world was never the same. And it's hard to exaggerate the impact that the life of that one man, Jesus, had on history. It's amazing when you stop and think about it. So we want to take a look at this event in Jesus' life and this miracle that He performed especially. And understand that we all probably, I don't think I'd be way out of the ballpark to say probably most of us here would like to see God at work, even more than He is in our lives here at NLCC, in our marriages, in our families, in our workplaces, in government, in the world. I mean, we would like to see God work, right? Yeah. So what can we do to cooperate with Him? To see Him work even more in our lives and in our families. What can we do there? Because there are some things here that are key. And it's amazing to me that God has called us into a partnership. In this business of reaching the world, He's called you and He's called me to partner with Him. And in this miracle, He partnered with the disciples, especially Peter, as he comes to the forefront. And you see this big event that changed their lives, and eventually, because their lives were changed the world. And you and I are here 2,000 years later because of the decision they made based on their experience with Jesus that day. So it's an amazing event. It's an earth-shattering event for these guys, and it was for the world as well. So let's go back and unpack it. Let's look at the first 3 verses. Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. One day as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, that's Galilee, the people were crowding around Him and listening to the Word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, that's Peter, and asked him to put out a little from the shore, and then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. The first thing that makes this miracle possible is sort of a duh. It has the duh factor attached to it, and that is Jesus' love for people. He was there because there was a great need. The whole reason He came in the first place was because He loved people. We see it everywhere. That love was manifest. It was demonstrated in His compassion. I love in Mark chapter 6, Jesus had finished teaching by the Sea of Galilee, and He was tired. They had been there all day, and He turned to the disciples and said, "Guys, let's cross over to the other side, get some rest, and just sort of chill." And they got in the boat, they took off, and the crowd saw them leave. And they went around the edge, they hurried around the edge, and they were there when they landed. Jesus had to be tired, had to be exhausted. If He was typically human, I wonder if He went, okay, here we go. All that human need in front of Him. But Mark 6 says He had compassion on them because He saw them as sheep without a shepherd, and He sat down and He began to teach them. Jesus' love for people compelled Him to do what He could to meet their need, to share the good news of the gospel with them, to show them who God really is. But we have to be careful here, because there is a thought process that focuses so much in on the love of Christ that we water His character down, and we end up not even worshiping the real Jesus. What we need to think about is this: His love was not like a doting grandfather, who was permissive and let the grandkids do whatever they wanted to do. That isn't the picture that we have of Jesus there. That's not who He was, and it's not who He is. His love would challenge people like He did the disciples. His love would make a tough choice. Remember the rich young ruler that came to Him and said, "Hey, what do I have to do to be saved?" And Jesus loved him immediately, it tells us in the Gospels. And he said, I want you to sell everything, give it to the poor, and come and follow me. And the guy couldn't do it. He refused to do it, and he walked away. Jesus gave him the hard choice because in his compassion, he met the real need, didn't he? He went to the root of the problem in this man's life, and that was his wealth. We see it over and over and over and over again, this compassion demonstrated because of the love of Christ for people around him. Christ's love is the root of the gospel, is it not? John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Without Jesus' love of people, none of this would happen. We wouldn't be here, and the world, including us, would be doomed to an eternity in hell. It's the basis, the foundation of everything that we believe and everything that we do and our very existence. So that's the first element that we want to look at as we look at what made this miracle possible. But let's take a look at another one. Another two, actually. We're going to look at verses 4 and 5. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch. And Simon answered, Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets. Second element is Peter's willingness to be obedient. His obedience. He began to make excuses. Did you catch that? And the reason he began to make excuses is because Jesus' command made no sense. It made no sense, number one, because they had already been out all night and they hadn't had any luck at all. And I'm sure because their livelihood depended on it, they were a little depressed about the whole thing. Anxious about it because they had bills to pay and families to feed, and they had just wasted an evening with no results at all. Number two, it made no sense because they fished at night on the Sea of Galilee in the shallow water. Jesus in broad daylight said, let's go out and let's go fishing. And I'm sure Peter was thinking, that just doesn't make sense. That's not what you do. I wonder if he thought, now Jesus, let's sit down here, think about this. That's not what you do on the Sea of Galilee. You fish at night. And number three, it's because it was in the deep water. And they fished in the shallows because any good fisherman knows that at night, the big ones come into the shallows under the cover of darkness and they feed on the little ones. And that makes them vulnerable. It just didn't make any sense. And he said, we've done this all night. And then he caught himself. This is my understanding of it. He caught himself and he said, but because you say so, I'm just going to trust you because you say so. We're going to do it. And the truth is, there are a lot of things that don't make sense to us, especially when we first become Christians. And they don't make sense to the world out there. But I've talked to people who just became followers of Jesus and surrendered their life to Jesus. And they would say, really? They would read, love your enemies. Really? You want me to love my enemies? Really? That doesn't make sense. Really, you want me to honor my dad and he's not honorable? He comes home drunk every night and he's abusive? But you want me to honor dad? That doesn't make sense. Really, you want me to wait until I'm married and before I move in with my boyfriend? That doesn't make sense. What's the problem with that? I mean, don't you want to try the relationship and experiment a little bit with it to see how it's going to work out before you make a commitment? Now, that makes perfect sense to the world, but you want me to wait until? And we could go on and on and on and on, couldn't we? Things that just don't make sense to the world. They don't make sense to a lot of folks when they first come to Christ. But Jesus said in John 14, if you love me, you will what? Obey my commandments. It's sort of interesting that we don't have any record here of Jesus explaining himself to Peter. He didn't feel it was necessary, and Peter didn't ask him to explain himself either. And you know what? God doesn't have to explain himself to us either. Number 2 is risky. It not only made no sense, it was a risky thing. Number 1, it could have damaged the nets. You know, they regularly had to wash and mend the nets. And I think some of the translations mentioned that they were mending their nets. It was a normal, everyday thing. And they had just finished that up. They had just completed that task. They were tired. They had been up all night. They just wanted to go home, go to bed. And when you're tired, you make a lot of silly mistakes, don't you? Because you're just not thinking clearly. So it was risky. And they were out in the deep water. And Galilee is known for sudden storms. They just blow up almost instantly. In 10, 15 minutes, the weather picture can change. And you remember, they were caught a couple of times out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee in the middle of a storm that they didn't anticipate. So there was some risk involved. But here's the real clincher. Here's what I wonder if Peter worried about, and that is that he would look foolish to the other guys. And to his friends who didn't know Jesus, who were going home to rest and prepare for the next night's sleep. I really wonder if he was saying, I really don't want to look like a fool. I wonder if he even thought that. But it's amazing that Peter was willing to be obedient. Nevertheless, because you say so, I'm gonna do it. And because he was obedient, his life was changed. He got to see that miracle, and he got to spend the next 3 years with Jesus face to face. Wouldn't it be great if you could sit around a fire with Jesus and just ask him whatever question you wanted to ask him? That's what Peter got to do because he was obedient. But here's the point. He had to get in deep. He had to go all out. Jesus said, from this point forward, you're going to be fishers of men. He learned that lesson, Simon did, and so did the other disciples. Because they were all out into the deep water, they got to see God work. We want to see God work in our lives. We want to see God work in our marriages. But we don't want to get out and get uncomfortable. We kind of want God to fix it for us. We're willing to do something, but don't ask us to do too much. We don't want to get in too deep here. I love John Ortberg's book. It's been around for a long time. It's called, If You Want to Walk on Water, You Got to Get Out of the Boat. And it's all based on that event in Jesus' life, another miracle. The disciples were caught in a storm out in the middle of Galilee. Jesus had gone up into the mountain to pray, and they looked out and they saw a figure coming to them on the surface of the water, and they thought it was a ghost. And Jesus said, "Don't worry, it's me." And Peter said, "If it's really you," this is typical Peter, "tell me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Okay." And I kind of wonder if Peter went, "Oh, crap." Me and my big mouth. But he did. He got out and he walked on the water. And that's an amazing thing. And Ortberg's point in the book is, if you want to walk on water, you got to get out of the boat. We tend to focus, if we've been around Christian circles very long, on the fact that Peter got out there a ways and he began to notice the waves and the wind and he began to sink. Peter was picked up by Jesus and together they walked back to the boat. I think we need to we need to focus not on Peter's weakness, but on the fact that he walked on water. He's the only person that ever walked on water in all of history outside of Jesus. And I wonder how hard he was to live with after that was all over. But if you want to walk on water, you got to get out of the boat. You got to go all out. Both feet. You got to take the plunge. I don't know how many different ways we can say it. Because playing it safe is not our calling. Playing it safe, taking the easy route, it keeps you comfortable. But people are like rivers. They get crooked by taking the path of least resistance. Our calling is to go in all the way, get in deep. When I was in college, we had a school of aviation, a missionary school of aviation. It was taught by, not Lloyd. Never mind. You wouldn't know him anyway. I can't think of his name right now. Anyway, I had a friend that was taking flying lessons, and every once in a while he would say, "You want to go with me? I'm going to go rent a plane, and we're going to do touch and goes." And they're just practicing landing and taking off, which is the best part of flying anyway. I think if you could just land and take off, I'd be happy as a lark. You get up there, it's kind of like riding a bus with a view. But I'd say, yeah, if I possibly could, I'd go with him. And we'd circle the airport and land, and he wouldn't stop. He'd just gun it, and we'd take off again. He said, "You want to do some stalls?" I said, "What's a stall?" He said, "Well, you go up straight like that until the motor quits." And he said, it's pretty cool because the plane kind of backs off like that, and you're weightless just for a second or two. And then when the nose goes down, the motor kicks back into gear, and it's fun. And I said, yeah, I was kind of dumb and ignorant. I said, yeah, let's do it. So we did the first one. That was kind of fun. I said, let's do it again. So we did it, another one and another one and another one, until I felt like I was going to lose my breakfast, and we gave up on it. But the thing is, I wouldn't trade that experience for anything. It was so cool. But the point is, if we would have left the airplane in the hangar, nothing. Airplanes were designed to fly. You were designed by God to live a life that is full and complete and abundant. And you can't do that if you stay comfortable. You know what happens when your main goal is to be comfortable in your faith, in your life? After a while, you wonder where God is. You just can't see Him work because you're not out there in the deep. And then you turn lukewarm, and then any ministry you're involved in is you give it a half-hearted effort, and the eventual conclusion is that you get bored, and so you just kind of drift through your Christian life, bored, and then a disaster happens, and you wonder where God was. A relationship with Jesus is like most anything else in life. You get out of it what you're willing to put into it. God calls us to a partnership. He doesn't call us and say, you know what, and pat us on the head and say, I'm going to take care of everything for you. He calls us to a partnership. And He calls us to challenge. The disciples were called, and they left everything. I hope that wasn't lost on you when we read it. They left everything to follow Him. I think it was important that they got those fish to shore because they had to be sold, and that would feed their family while they were gone. They left their livelihood, they left their friends, they left their hometown, they left their family, and we know at least Peter was married. They were all in. They were getting in deep. They were taking the plunge. And that's what God calls us to. He calls us to take the plunge. Now, understand, God is moving. And if you want to see Him move in your life, you got to take the plunge. You got to get in deep. You got to go all out. I mean, he's moving around the world. If you talk to missionaries, and I'm really excited because Todd Gilliland, and some of you know him, he sort of grew up coming to NLCC, used to sing when he was little, and his folks, Tim and Terry, are folks that we used to sing with, and a lot of you know him, and for that I apologize for Tim. And tell him I said that, you'll be with him. But Todd's going to come. He's been in Uganda, Africa, the last few years, feeling called to the mission field there, and some amazing things have happened in their ministry. He was here last year. He's going to come and he's going to speak in our services. And don't say, well, you know, it's just a missionary, it's going to be boring. It's not going to be boring, I guarantee you. And you'll be excited to see what God is doing. God's working around the world, but Todd had to get in deep. He had to go in deep. I was listening to Matt Chandler from the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and he was talking about how God is moving around the world, and they have a guy from their congregation that's in the Middle East, and he couldn't name the country. But he said one of the elders of the church went to visit him, and they decided that they were going to go into an area that really wasn't wise to go into. It was a very dangerous place to go, at least by the world's standards. And they were driving down the road, and he pulled into a gas station to fill up. And he filled up, and he said there was an old guy there with a beard this long, just like staring a hole right through them. He didn't smile, he didn't move, he was just staring at them. And they were getting uneasy, and his wife was there with them. And they filled up as quickly as they could and paid the bill and got in the car and took off. And it was quiet for a while. His wife was in the front seat with him, and the other guy, the elder, was in the back. And pretty soon his wife broke the silence. She said, you know, I would rather be married to a martyr than to a coward. And so they turned around and they went back and they approached the guy, explained who they were, and his eyes lit up, and he said, and I know some of you might think this is weird, and it feels that way. He said, you know what? I had a vision a couple of weeks ago that somebody was going to come and tell me about Jesus, and I was told to come and sit here and wait for you. Yeah. But you know what? Those guys would never have experienced that if they hadn't gone all in. Let's take it closer to home. You know, I know a guy who was in high school, was getting ready to go to Bible college, and he was working at a grocery store. And when people would say, well, what are you going to do? He said, well, I'm going to go into the ministry. Well, they'd give him a pretty tough time. But there was a guy that worked with him by the name of Tony. And Tony was about as pagan as he could be. I mean, he partied every Friday and Saturday night. He smoked some, not tobacco either. And he was pretty cynical about the church and anything related to Jesus. And went for all summer long. Couldn't make any progress with Tony. Was ready to give up. Went off to school. Came back, Christmas vacation, and guess who was in the worship service? Tony. And the response was, wow, wouldn't have bet on that. There are lots of opportunities, guys. If we want to go all in, we can go all in. The choice is yours. Doesn't make sense. I got bills to pay. I got family. I don't have time. I got work to get to. We can make all those excuses, but until we say, but because you say so, we're going to limit what God can do in our life because it's a partnership. Remember when Jesus went to Nazareth and he came out of Nazareth, and it says he really couldn't do very many things there. He couldn't do very many miracles there because there wasn't much faith in Nazareth. They thought of him as an illegitimate child of Mary. We got to get in. Lastly, and I need to move quickly here, let's look at verses 6 and 7. The last element that goes into this mix. that will help us see God at work. When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break, and so they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. The next element is teamwork. Teamwork. The catch was so big, they couldn't get it on board. So they hollered at the other boat, say, guys, we got to have some help here. And in fact, one of the Gospels says it looked like it was going to sink. And so they got their help there because the task was just too big. And the truth is that God has called us to reach the world out there. Not just New London and Southeast Iowa, but the world out there. And the task is just too big for us to do it on our own. And so He has gifted us, don't laugh at this, with each other. And you're going, oh, great. Yeah. No returns. He's given us each other in the church. That's part of the function of the church, is to develop that sense of teamwork. Working together is what's important here. I used to ski when I was in high school. I don't ski anymore. I could, but I broke my knee, and the doctor said, you won't want to. So I don't. But we took Diane out one time. In college, a bunch of us went out, and I was kind of showing off a little bit, and on a slope I shouldn't have been on, and I'm going to blame somebody that went before me because they left a great big hole. You know, they fell, and they didn't patch the hole, and so my ski tips hit it, and I was going downhill blazing, and my ski tips caught the lip of that hole, and I rolled and rolled and rolled and rolled. Diane thought I was dead, and I wasn't. But I found out an important lesson in life, and you have to have both skis going the same direction. That's helpful. Same is true for us. We as God's people have to understand that we have to work together if we're going to be of impact at all in New London or Henry County or Southeast Iowa or in the world. We got to all be on the same page and going the same direction. And so what can we do to nurture that? Well, let's look at Ephesians chapter 4, verse 3. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. And then let's look at verse 2. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. What can we do to nurture this sense of teamwork? Well, we need to understand that it's a priority for God. Jesus, the night before He was crucified, said, Father, I pray for those who will believe in me because of these disciples, that they will be one, even as you and I are one, that the world may believe that you have sent me. You know what's going to change New London, Iowa? What's going to really impact New London, Iowa for the gospel, or Henry County, or Southeast Iowa? It isn't our great praise team. It isn't great preaching. It isn't a beautiful building. It isn't programs and programs and more programs. Jesus says right here, it's being together. It's the oneness. It's the relationship. It's the singleness of heart that will convince the world that Jesus has something valuable to offer. And everything else is a counterfeit. He says that they will be one, that the world will believe that you have sent me. Reaching the world depends on our willingness to nurture teamwork. So how do we do that? Number one, we learn to control our egos. Most church problems are caused by egos. They have to do with power struggles. And so we need to control our egos. If we're going to reach our potential, we need to harness our egos. I was born out west, and we made a big deal out of quarter horses out there because they were working horses. They would cut a calf out of a herd for branding or whatever, and they were fun to watch. Very disciplined, very well trained, but that horse had to submit itself to taking a bit, to taking a blanket, to taking a saddle, and eventually to taking a rider, and to be submissive to the nudges and the directions that the rider gave it as it worked. It could never reach its full potential if it remained spirited and unwilling to submit. So we have to let go of our egos. We probably ought to have a sign out there, check your ego in here. Because there's so many problems that are caused by egos. You know, let's get real here. There are some people who are craving attention. They're constantly vying for attention. And so they'll get next to the pastor, whether they like him or not, because there's an association there, and they think that somehow that's going to rub off, and they get more attention there. Or they cozy up to elders, or a Sunday school teacher, or some other leader in the church. And when they get overlooked, if their birthday isn't acknowledged, then they're angry and they feel slighted. They have that sense of entitlement. It's all ego. It just is. Or they get critical. You know, on the way home, they're tearing the worship service apart. Well, the music was too loud, or it was too soft. I hate that song. Mandy was off key just a little bit. Did you hear that? The preacher was too long. He was too loud. He made no sense. I couldn't follow him. It was, on and on and on. Did you ever hear about the guy that was driving home, his little son in the back seat, and he was talking to his wife, and they were just tearing the worship service apart and tearing the preacher apart, and the son finally got up and he said, "You know, Dad, it's not a bad show for $1, is it?" Yeah. We have to set aside our ego. And here's another one. Ego makes it difficult for us to submit to the Word of God. I've been there. And there are some things that I have to deal with to submit to the will of God, and my ego gets in the way. And I'm not going to tell you what they are, because none of your business. But yeah, it could be somebody who said, "Really? I'm supposed to be baptized? They're never going to get me in that baptistry. They're not going to get me in that water. Really? I'm supposed to give generously? Maybe even tithe? The church just wants money. They're not going to get their hands on my money." And honestly, we're supposed to submit, and on and on and on it goes. Ego makes it tough to submit to the Word of God. But Jesus said it. If you love me, you'll obey my commandments. And then lastly, it makes it hard when we disagree with somebody to resolve a disagreement. You know what ego does? When you have a disagreement with the elders or with the staff or somebody else in the church in authority, ego goes and tries to recruit reinforcements and then come back in power. That's just plain politics, folks. And that splinters the congregation. It does nothing to unify us. And in the 3rd chapter of Ephesians 4 says, "Make every effort to preserve the unity of the Spirit." When we come to Christ, we are joined together. It's our egos that get in the way and begin to splinter us apart and to separate us. So the first thing we need to do, you and me alike, is to control our egos, to submit them to the Lord. Number 2, we need to make teamwork, togetherness, a priority. It's obvious as you read the New Testament, especially the book of Acts, that Christians belong together. In Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through about 48, it talks about the early church, the very infant church, just born. And I think the word together there is used 4 or 5 times in those verses. They were together. The Boy Scouts know you've got to be together. The Girl Scouts know it. The Kiwanis clubs know it. Everybody knows it. But there's always a problem, it seems, with God's people. They tend to drift away, often because their egos are in the way. And so, Paul wrote in Hebrews 10, verse 25, let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Already in the first century, people were skipping out on being together. Sunday morning is a time for us to pray for each other, to catch up with each other, to worship together, to encourage each other, to comfort each other, to recharge, to face the world out there. And God calls us to be together. And hopefully and prayerfully, Sunday morning is not the only time that you are together with God's people. Maybe not in mass, but at least in small group. Because the third thing that he calls us to do is to be encouragers. He already said that. To spur one another on to good works and to encourage them all the more as you see the day approaching. What's the day? The second coming of Jesus. Let's read Hebrews 3:13. Encourage one another daily as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. So how often are we to be together long enough to encourage one another? He says daily. That means be an encourager out there and surround yourself with people who will encourage you as well. That may mean that there have to be some boundaries put up with some folks in your life that bring you down. Those basement people. I have a friend that used to refer to them. And you focus in on those relationships that build you up and encourage you. So be an encourager and surround yourself with encouragers as well. That's what it's all about. This whole business of being together is to encourage each other, to pray for one another, to equip one another. And I'm an old guy, I know I am. I'm not sure that a cyber community will get the job done. I'm just not sure. Sometimes you just need flesh and blood. And you need to look at people in the eye and work things out. You can always unfollow somebody on Facebook or hide them. But that's not what God has called us to. He's called us to genuine togetherness, genuine relationship with His people and with Himself. Unfortunately, in this culture, it's easy when we find ourselves at odds with somebody to go find another church, instead of working it out, sitting down and working on us so we are once again together. Lastly, what can we do to nurture this oneness, this togetherness? We need to watch our tongues. Hebrews 4:29. Don't let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouth, but only what is profitable for those who are listening. Only that which will build up, some translations say, those who are listening. The tongue, whew, yeah. I don't even think we need to pursue that any longer, because we all know the power that the tongue can have. So what will be the impact when we're all in? When we're in deep? When we nurture that togetherness, when we make it a priority in our lives, and we follow Jesus wholeheartedly, 100%. What will be the impact when we become genuinely obedient and we say, whatever it is that you want of me, I am willing to do it? Well, what was the impact in Peter's life? It says when he saw the great big catch of fish that Jesus had generously given them, he was astonished, as were the guys with him. They were amazed. They were filled with wonder. When's the last time you've been filled with wonder when you considered what Christ has done for you in life? Or you considered what Christ has done on the cross? Or what He's just accomplished, something that you've seen Him move to accomplish in your family or in your life or in your relationships at work? Have you been amazed? Why not? Maybe it's because you're standing ankle deep in the shallows and you're refusing to go in deep. And Simon worshiped. And he fell at his knees and he knew who Jesus was at that point. And he worshiped, and lastly, he made the commitment. He followed. Jesus said, "Follow me. From this day forward, I'll make you fishers of men." And they left everything to follow Him. And we know that all but John were martyred for their faith. They gave it all. The final sacrifice. And it started in Luke 5. Learning these lessons. So what do you want to see God accomplish in your life? Are you willing to go all in, or just want Him to fix it for you? The choice is yours, because He calls you to a partnership. He doesn't promise to fix it for you. He calls you to a partnership. Will you partner with me? Is He saying? So that's what we're going to leave you with today. And I want you to consider all of that as you leave this place, as you get up in the morning. Am I willing to go all in? Why am I not seeing God work? Why am I lukewarm? Is it because I'm not in deep? I'm just ankle deep. So if you will, let's stand together in honor of the Lord. And I'm going to have a closing prayer. And we're going to give you 10 or 15 minutes to gather kids or things, whatever you need to gather, and meet back here for our annual meeting. So let's pray together, and then we will be dismissed. Father in heaven, we thank You for who Jesus is. We thank You that He loved us enough to come show us who You are, that He had compassion on us, that even though we were still sinners in rebellion against Him, He went to the cross and was willing to be crucified in our place. Father, help us to learn to be obedient and to go all in when You call us to ministry of some sort. Not to hold back, not to argue, but to be like Peter and say, because You say so, even if it doesn't make sense, even if it's too risky in the world's point of view. Because we know if we love You, we will obey. And Father, help us to nurture that sense of unity here at NLCC and with other Christians that we're familiar with and have relationships with. And Father, help us to set aside our egos and learn to keep them under control, because they're so deadly and so dangerous to relationships and to churches. Father, help us in all of this to be as much like Jesus as we possibly can. And we know that You'll continue to work in us to that end, so that the world will see Him in us and come to Him. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thanks, guys.